Okay, I think we're ready to start. So thanks everybody for coming today. First panel of the session. So I just want to introduce the panel really. So today what we'd like to talk about is there's really feel like a disconnect between public perception of prisons, their function in society and daily life of prisoners and what the actual reality of prison life is like. And so joining me today to discuss these issues, a panel of experts from across the criminal justice system. I'd like to start with Geoff at the end.
I'm Geoff Whelan. Some of you might recognise me. I organise QED, I run the Greater Manchester Skeptic Society, I write a legal column for the Skeptic magazine, and in my spare time I am a practising criminal barrister. I've been doing it 21 years. I've dealt with extremely serious offences for the past 10 years or so, murders, rapes, conspiracies, generally practising in the Crown Court.
Emma?
I'm Emma. Some of you may have just seen me. I'm a solicitor. I've been a solicitor for just over 1 year, qualified, so not quite as long as Geoff, but I've been doing it for longer. I specialise in parole, representing prisoners at parole hearings, so life sentence and recall prisoners. So after Geoff has put them in prison, then I try and get them out again.
Yeah. Pays our mortgages.
And Phil?
I'm Phil Scraton. I'm a Professor of Criminology at Queen's University in the School of Law. Although most people will know me better at the moment for my work in Hillsborough, my longest term work is on prisons. I first started going into prisons when I was 23, not to be detained, and I was outraged by what I found in prison. I taught in prison for that year, and ever since then I've been working on prisons, in prisons, wrote the Scottish Independent Report on the prison uprisings in the 1980s, Prisons Under Protest, the book for the Open University Press in 92, and my most recent book with two of my colleagues is about to be published. It's on women in prison post-Causton, and that follows the last book, which was our work on where I live now, in the north of Ireland, which was on women's imprisonment, or as I would prefer to call it, women's incarceration. That followed on from 2 years, or two reports for the Human Rights Commission in Northern Ireland on the conditions in prison for women in the north, with Linda Moore. And so it's a long association with imprisonment. And as you'll hear, I'm a penal abolitionist.
Well, you sort of preempted my first question there, Phil. So what I wanted to start with really is by briefly asking the panel, what do we think prison is for? Geoff, do you like to answer that question?
Well, I can tell you what the government thinks prison's for, and what the purpose of sentencing is. The Criminal Justice Act 2003 says it's for the punishment of offenders, the reduction of crime, brackets, including its reduction by deterrence, C, the reform and rehabilitation of offenders, D, the protection of the public, and E, the making of reparation by offenders to persons affected by their offences. Now, the critical thinkers amongst you, and there may be one or two, might have spotted that some of those purposes are contradictory and mutually exclusive. So you have a difficulty there with a statute that says you've got to do all these things, and I can absolutely guarantee you that prison, for example, is not very good at the rehabilitation of offenders. And the more people you put in prison, the less good it gets at rehabilitating offenders because they do not have the money to do it properly.
Emma?
So I would, my idealistic position, I would agree with Phil in terms of sort of penal abolition, but from sort of the current state of the world that we live in, ideally prison should be for rehabilitation, in my view. I don't think the punishment part of it plays any useful role in society in terms of if the aim of prison should be to stop that person from causing harm to society and making sure that they don't do it again. Is my view, but as Geoff said, at the moment, the current status of affairs at the moment means that it's not doing any of those. It's punishing people, yes, but I don't think that's what it should be doing.
No. Phil, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I mean, it's a lie. It's a false promise. It's a dichotomy. It's all of those things. Prisons are completely counter to justice. They're counter to rehabilitation. In fact, I don't even know what rehabilitation anymore means in that context. If you're taking people, and I'm not talking about the small minority of very serious offences, they have to be put on one side and they have to be put in their context. But the majority of people who are in prison, the notion of rehabilitation is perhaps one of the worst lies of our generation. It was appalling to read this week that Victorian prisons that were supposed to have been mothballed 15 years ago, were due to be closed in the next 5 years, are now going to be kept open indefinitely, at the same time that there are going to be 10,000 more prison places. There are building of 2 supermax prisons which will house up to 2,000 people. And that concept or that idea of prison as rehabilitative is quite simply a con. You can't rehabilitate the majority of people who are going back into exactly the same environment that they come from. If poverty is a major issue, if drugs are a major issue, if violence is a major issue in communities, that is where those issues have to be dealt with. To simply lift people out, put them into prisons where they will serve about 3/4 of their time in solitary confinement, because that is the pressure that prisons are under. They're locked in their cells for about 3/4 of the time, and expect them to come out in some way back into those communities and live ordinary lives. That's why there is a revolving door. It's no mystery. It's absolutely clear. And I mean, there are so many cases I could go through over the hundreds down the years to illustrate that. So where I would start is the deceit, the national deceit that we can be rehabilitative. It's the 3 R's, that we can resettle, or that we can, as they put it, reintegrate. Reintegrate into what? Reintegrate into which communities? That is an appalling deceit. And the final thing I would want to say on that is the level of mental ill health in prisons is astronomical now. It is, as many prison officers will tell you, it has become a dumping ground for people who have very serious mental issues that have to be dealt with in other circumstances. And in actual fact, the alternatives to prison for the vast majority of those people are cheaper than the £80,000 a year to £150,000 a year it takes to keep any single individual in prison.
So I think from that initial discussion, I think the panel would agree that prison should be about rehabilitation, should at least attempt to rehabilitate. That should be its primary focus. It clearly isn't working from some of the reasons Phil's outlined there. So why is this happening? Why isn't it rehabilitating people? Emma, you have already said you're going to prison on a regular basis. Can you describe some of the current conditions in prison and give some specific examples?
They're fun holiday camps, and they're all about TVs. So the main, obviously, prisons have sort of perpetually seemed to be in crisis. There have been historic riots and things like that, which have been obviously well documented and things, but at the moment I'd say there's a particularly acute crisis going on at the moment, and the main reason for that is that there are too many prisoners and there are not enough staff. So the Ministry of Justice publish the number of prisoners every Friday, if you feel like checking it out on a Friday evening. So yesterday the prison population was 86,337 out of a total usable capacity of 87,358, which means there's about 1,000 spare spaces in the whole country. It's about 99.04% capacity we're at the moment, and that's about 10,000 more than what the MOJ say is a sort of a safe number. So at the moment, people are just being put where there are beds, and they're not being put in, where it would be better for them, say closer to family, closer to particular coursework and things like that. And then on top of that, since 2010, when austerity came in, the prison service has lost about 1/3 of its staff, because the only way to reduce the costs at the MOJ that as drastically as they wanted to is to cut the wage bill, and so they've lost about a third of prison staff since 2010, which means they've got this enormous number of prisoners and not enough staff, which means that they can't even have any semblance of doing even purposeful activity, as Phil said. And you might not believe us, my clients are very often, and most of them, in their cells 23 hours a day at the moment. They get out for that hour, and that time they have to call me. They call me in that hour that they're out of their cell, and then you'll have people begrudge the fact they've got a TV or something to do in that 23 hours that they're in their cell, and then wonder why that so many of them are trying to harm themselves or come out more damaged than they went in.
Mm-hmm. Phil, are these conditions a recent thing, or are these long-standing issues?
Yeah, they're long-standing, but they've been exacerbated certainly since Tony Blair's government, and then prior to that, obviously, the issue of Thatcherism. I think it's really important because we might have people who are prisoners or former prisoners in the room, but we haven't got anybody up here. I want to bring, if I may, if you'll indulge me, three women's voices who I think it brings it home to us what we're really talking about when we talk about the construct of rehabilitation. I would never use that phrase myself. I would prefer to use the phrase warehousing, because that's exactly as you've just described it, 23 hours locked in a cell. At the end of the day, I know that if anything happens to me, there'll be an investigation. I never ripped the mattress or the blanket, nor did I block the spy. If I take pneumonia, it'll all come out. I think you can only last 10 or 12 days without drinking, because then you dehydrate and your kidneys go. I've no intention of eating or drinking again, so they're beat there. I know that they all love me dead, but I'll make sure everything is revealed first. I gave expert evidence. I wouldn't call myself an expert, but I gave expert evidence at her inquest after she took her own life. That's Annie Kelly, and I'm using her last letter home with the permission of her family. Time to die. Today has been an okay week and day, except this evening the voices are getting really bad. I can't put up with them much more. There was a code blue tonight, that's an emergency, on the wee lads in Elm. The women in Northern Ireland are housed in exactly the same prison as the young men. Code blue is when someone's hung themselves and died, so we're locked up all night. If these voices keep up, there'll be another code blue tonight. I already have a noose made and ready, and I can't do anything till the night staff do the alarms. Then I have an hour. I got it planned, and tonight is the night. That was Frances McClure, and again, evidence at her inquest, used again with the permission of her family. She took her own life that very night. And finally, Kira, who was a child in a women's prison. This is 2009. I was put in the hospital wing for 9 days. They brought me over here, the punishment and segregation block, for one night. That night I tried to hang myself and they wouldn't take me back over. I hear voices and see things. You can see the pattern of really serious mental issues. The voices tell me to do them. That's self-harm. And I release the pain as well. It's terrible, so it is. You sleep and you keep changing positions. Just look at what they make me go to the toilet in, a small cardboard or paper tub in the corner. That's for night time. It's a disgrace. They don't give me underwear or nothing. It's hard. They just give you a wee sanitary towel and that's it. It's hard, just stuck in the cell with a camera, no privacy or nothing. Your dignity's taken away. They just said, it's your own fault, you're behind the door. That was Kira. She was in the punishment block in Hyde Bank Wood, and I asked her permission if I could go into a cell with Linda, obviously. Nothing had prepared me for that moment. This is a young woman who had been abused since she was 13. She'd been exploited within her family. She'd never committed any serious offences. The most serious offence was attacking police officers who tried to arrest her. And she was self-harmed from her wrists to her shoulders, from her ankles to as far as I could see up. There's hardly a bit of her flesh that wasn't torn. And her canvas gown was held together with sellotape. She slept on a concrete plinth. She had a canvas sheet, blanket, which she was allowed to keep all day that she sat on. She had nothing else in her strip cell. that was the way we were treating and continue to treat young people in prison, and it's our responsibility, it's our taxes. And as I say, as somebody who'd been researching all those years, nothing prepared me for those moments meeting Kira. And when I was leaving, the senior officer, we call them guards actually, said, so what did she tell you? And I said, you know exactly what she will have told me. And he said, well, it'll be your word against mine. And I pulled the tape recorder out of my pocket and said, no, it won't be. And that's the battle that you face. And I think we also have to be careful about the language we use around prisons. There isn't a crisis in prisons, it's a malaise. They're not riots, they're uprisings. There is always a reason why people riot or they rise up within prison. And they are some of the examples of how serious it can become. And we turn our back on it.
Mm. Phil, I think everybody in here would probably say it was incredibly moving hearing those personal stories from those women. And it's important that their voices are heard because it's so... We don't hear those stories at all. And Geoff, I'd like to bring you in here. I mean, given what we've just heard from Phil there, you're often on the other side. You're the prosecutor in a lot of cases. And, you know, we hear stories in the press about prisoners having vodka-fueled parties. There doesn't seem to be a week goes by where we don't hear the prisoners living in the lap of luxury type story from a certain section of the press. That completely goes against everything that Phil's just described. As a prosecutor, how do you find the public pressure in your role to deliver custodial sentences? Is there a pressure and is that growing?
There's undoubtedly a pressure. There has been an upward pressure on jail sentences for quite a number of years now. Prisoners are serving longer sentences. People who are convicted of lesser offences that previously might not have gone to prison are getting jail sentences. The Sentencing Guideline Council sets out, and it's supposed to sort of allow there to be consistency across the country, but it sets out the types of sentences that are appropriate for a large number of offences. So that if you're convicted in York or Canterbury, you'll get the same sentence for the same offence. But the thing is, these guidelines seem to create an upward pressure on the use of prison. And that's certainly been the case over the past 10, 15 years at least. I mean, I'm a card-carrying member of the Labour Party, but I can tell you, I think Jack Straw created something like 4,500 new offences at the time. He was, by no stretch of the imagination, a Liberal Home Secretary. And I'm afraid that that has continued over the years. And it's not helped by the Daily Mail or indeed the Mirror. But it isn't just the right-wing press. You'll find this pressure for jail amongst pretty much, I would say, a large number of people in this room. I mean, I'm friends with quite a lot of you on Facebook, and a story might crop up. For example, some lad is racing through London on his bike, and he crashes into someone and he kills a woman. It's a tragic case, but there's an outcry that that man should go to jail, and he was prosecuted for manslaughter. And then there's an outcry that, well, if there isn't an appropriate offence, we should have a new offence of causing death by reckless cycling. And that's happened before with causing death by careless driving, whereas previously people would get off. I say get off, and that's the phrase that the right-wing press and some in the left would use because it's seen as a let-off. They would be fined because previously that offence didn't exist. We're criminalising more and more behaviour, sending more and more people to jail, and as we've heard, the system's getting worse. It's not working. The 5 purposes of imprisonment, the only one that seems to be working is punishment. Deterrence doesn't work at all, because if you're speaking to someone who's got a heroin problem, they're not going to think, well, I won't go out and burgle this house because I know I'm going to get a 3-year mandatory sentence. What they're thinking of is, how do I get my next hit?
All the heroin addicts I know started in prison.
Yeah. Well, revolving door. The system simply is at breaking point. I probably wouldn't quite agree with Phil that you need to do away with prison. because
say that, but
I know you said that there's a small proportion of cases where you would still need prison.
We'll talk about that.
But I think what you have to have, and this is where the press and the politicians bear a great deal of responsibility, because there's an echo chamber. There has to be public support for the system, and the way it's drummed up at the moment, the public will only support an increase in sentences and the taking away of privileges for people who are serving sentences, and they are not invested in rehabilitation. You know, ask anybody in the street what should happen, and you hear, oh, string them up, throw away the key, and whatever. It's not productive. We need to think critically about what works, because if what you want to do is stop crime, don't put people in prison for longer and longer, because all you're going to do is warehouse the problem for a short period of time, and they'll come out and they'll do it again, because there's been no real attempts at stopping the root causes of the offending.
I think at that point, have we got any questions from the audience? Short question, Kat? Just take a couple of questions and then we'll get back into it.
It's not necessarily on the what you've been talking about, but recently it was revealed that the main sex offender treatment program that they have in prison
doesn't work, makes them worse,
and in some cases led to more reoffending. So my first question is, were you surprised? And secondly, what do you feel about the future of other treatment programs in prison, whether they do have a feasible future?
Okay, so I guess I'll take that. So there used to be for sexual offenders a course called the Sex Offender Treatment Program, imaginative title. The idea being for people to address their offending and try and work out why they had committed their offence and to use strategies to make sure that they didn't do it again. And at the start of this year, they stopped doing that course because they published some research that showed that it at best did nothing and at worst made some offenders worse for various reasons. Now, you asked if I was surprised. No. The evidence is that the course itself was perhaps, if it's delivered correctly, could have some positive effects. That part of it comes on to what we're talking about. Part of the problem is it was rolled out en masse and was being delivered by not by sort of specially trained psychologists. It was being delivered by normal prison staff who'd done a couple of days of training. It's being delivered in large group settings rather than more individualised settings. So if you're in a group setting with sex offenders, unfortunately some of them, you've got them all together having committed these offences, that can be supportive of the attitudes that they hold. Some of them will get off on it, unfortunately, and it's that's very unhelpful. So they have stopped it. So at the moment they've brought some new courses in some ways those they're called Horizon and Kaizen. They're helpful in terms of that you can now do those courses if you maintain your innocence, which is something that wasn't available on a sex offender treatment program, and lots of people do maintain their innocence of offences. So at least there's something for them to do to at least show they're willing to move forward. The problem is with those courses is that with the sex offender treatment program, they're not properly evaluated or tested yet. We still don't really know if they work either. From my perspective, obviously, I've had some clients who waited a very long time to do sex offender treatment work, and some of them got pulled off mid-course, having waited years to do it, willingly waited to do it, and now they're now on another 2-year waiting list to do Kaizen, and we don't know if that works either. And they have to prove to these are people who have to prove to the parole board that their risk is manageable in the community. So it's causing a lot of problems at the moment.
Wasn't that covered on Skeptics with a K?
Yes, it was me on the. Yeah.
Did we have a one more question?
Can I just add something on that? I teach a program, Gender, Sexuality and Violence, in my postgraduate teaching. I think one of the problems with the whole concept of sex offender is it's a kind of blanket term for a very complex set of issues. It's very easy for us to label an individual or a group of individuals as sex offender or sex offenders without actually looking at the complexity of their offending, who they're offending, how they're offending, their own histories. And so the idea that you can have a one-size-fits-all course or program that is going to address those complexities, and then you put it inside a prison where you concentrate that group of people together. It even went, I'm old enough to remember, when Peterhead Prison was condemned as a prison, 18th century prison in north of Scotland, and they turned it into a sex offenders jail. And they brought sex offenders from all over Scotland and put them all in this condemned prison. And they offered, supposedly, one-size-fits-all courses. It was just, I mean, you didn't have to be a social scientist to work out that that was going to fail. It was obvious it was going to fail, to say nothing of the fact that you put a whole range of people right up in the north of Scotland when most of them came from the central Scotland belt. So people who were supporting them, families who were trying to keep contact with them, couldn't get there. So, you know, all of those issues, when we talk about them, when we ask about them, we have to unpack them. And of course, that's the problem we have in the public domain, that people don't want to get into the intricacies of these issues because of the way in which the media, but also our socialization makes us think. I spent a lot of time in Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, where all of these issues in terms of incarceration are dealt with in an incredibly different way, where the lack of punitivity built into the process is what is pulled right back, where we don't talk about incarceration. And I think that's the, you know, that's the issue from my point of view, is the way in which that popular discourse has been so pursued to help to make us think in these categories and boxes without unpacking the complexity.
And so, just to add to that, in terms of sort of the warehousing point, in terms of putting all of those sex offenders in Scotland, that's a problem at the moment in England as well. There are exclusive sex offender jails, which they have to do for practical purposes, because there are so many prisoners, and because the vast majority of the prison population can and will attack VPs, vulnerable prisoners. They warehouse them all together, so you've got whole prisons that are full of sex offenders, and then trying to fix them with sort of one-size-fits-all courses that turn out don't work. So,
if we have one more quick question, Kat.
Hiya. You talk of rehabilitation as if it is possible. Do you think that maybe for most people, like when we have all our trying to change anybody's position on smoking or obesity, maybe for many prisoners it's not possible? Is that something you accept, or do you think no, most prisoners can be changed and rehabilitated?
So there are some people who are currently in prison who are, I would describe as so damaged that it will never be possible for them to be safely managed in the community. I've met several people like that, I would say, who are never going to be in a position where we can leave them in the community, but the reason for that is because the people I'm talking about, these are the sort of the worst case, the nightmare people that you talk about, you know, child sex murderers, and the really damaged people. That they are really damaged people. That their histories are often absolutely appallingly, horrifically awful. I can't even. It's the worst childhood you can possibly imagine, sort of scenarios, which has caused their psyche, their personality to develop in such a way that it can't be unpicked in a way that will make them safe. But that, I don't think that means that they can't. That doesn't mean they can't have fulfilling lives. I think we can still be compassionate about them. They've obviously committed horrific offences, but we can still have an element of compassion and give them fulfilling lives within confines. But we don't. It doesn't need to be called prison. It doesn't need to have that punitive element on top of it, I don't think.
Phil, have you got anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I reject the concept of rehabilitation as it is written in all of the government reports and in the prison inspection reports. The prison inspection reports work on the basis of 4 principles, what they call the healthy prison, which is an oxymoron. I don't believe that there is such a place as a healthy prison. It's a phrase taken from the World Health Organization. Those 4 are safety, respect, purposeful activity, and resettlement. And resettlement is another word they use, really, for the popular phrase rehabilitation. It's impossible if the majority of people are in prison, and exactly as you've said, we're talking about a small minority when we're talking about really very serious offences. The majority of people who are in prison, who go through that revolving door, and it's an increasing number on a day-by-day basis, those people are going back into a community, into a situation where their lives are in exactly the same position as they were when they left it. How can we conceptualize a notion of rehabilitation when they're already habituated to that community and life in that community? The majority of men who assault women don't go to prison, full stop. The majority of men who rape women, if by rape we mean unwanted sex, don't go to prison. So if men who are convicted of those offences, and they're a very small minority compared to the offences that are committed, are going back into those very same communities where women are treated as objects, then in that situation, how can we talk about a rehabilitative framework outside of it when that is the process they go back to, the place they go back to? If you take another example and they're going back into dire poverty, and they're going back into, you know, mining villages that were so solid years ago that now are riven by heroin use, you know, or the latest drugs. You know, if they're going back into those situations, the concept of rehabilitation is false because they are perfectly habituated to the places that they live in. So it's a much bigger issue. We can't take prisons. We know prisons are over there. We know they're outside of us and outside of the communities. Well, they're inside the communities, but they're locked walls in the communities in which we live. We can't decontextualize the issues in prison from what are the issues in our communities. And it's only when we address those issues in our communities that we can begin to start to consider alternatives to prison that operate in a reformative way. And I don't mean reform of the individual, I mean reform of the kind of society that creates those individuals who end in prison. I was that far away from imprisonment. I come from a Liverpool working class family, first person in my family to go to university. I do a thing with my middle class students, you know, 300 of them. When did you last break the law? 20 questions. No one ever doesn't break the law. So, but Phil, we wouldn't do it. Serious offences. Yeah, right. And, you know, and that whole process of us condemning the them and us relationship, the distance we put between ourselves and people who are seen to commit criminal acts, and the distance we put between community and prison, to me, is the real issue that we have to contend with. And it's not an idealistic argument at all. It's one that obviously I'm dedicated to, and the debate will go on long after I'm dead. But the point that I'm making is that it is an argument that we have to have. And I don't believe that out there, once it's explained, there is that punitive mentality. When we produced our report in Northern Ireland, Linda and I said, well, I think we should go away for a week because when this gets published, the Belfast Telegraph right-wing newspaper is going to hammer us. What did they have? Full front page, prison shame. Because it was the undeniable truth. What those women were enduring in those prisons, we'd been there over 100 days, was the undeniable truth. And so from my point of view, I don't think it's beyond the wit of people, once they have the real facts, the real understanding of what prisons do to people and what it does, therefore, to us, I don't believe that that punitive mentality is not movable.
Can I just add, Nick?
Yeah,
Sorry. It's just following on from what Phil said. I've probably often said flippantly at parties that I'm completely against the legalisation of drugs because I get so much work from the crime that's committed by people who are on drugs. And this is probably, there's enough material here for another panel, so we'll think about that maybe for next year. But if there was a proper grown-up approach to drug use, you could probably halve the prison numbers overnight by, instead of criminalising something that somebody really hasn't got the ability to deal with, it's an addiction, it's criminalised, they go out and commit crime, some of it's serious, but if you take a different approach, as other countries have, then the problem will change. But you're not going to change that unless there's a change in the view of the government and the society that makes that government in power?
I think from what we've discussed so far, I can all say that clearly prison as a place for rehabilitation isn't working. There's plentiful examples of why conditions are. Only this year, Pentonville Prison, for example, was described by the Independent Monitoring Board that as squalid and inhumane. So there's plenty of examples of prison not functioning at all.
Well, we had last week, I think it's Albert, who is the boss of the Prison Governors Association. She said to the government, what you need to do is release everyone who is on a sentence of less than 12 months because it does not work. That's the head of the Prison Governors Association. Now, the government knows they don't work, but they're not going to do it because the outcry would be outrage. And in fairness, Albert knew that because she said, well, there's no votes in this. There isn't. Well, perhaps there should be.
Yeah. When you say, but to take Phil's point about not being sure what the reaction is, if you show them the evidence, then sometimes that they'll come round. And I'm sort of reluctant to mention even the name of this paper in front of Phil, but the Sun did recently themselves articulate that prison numbers should be reduced quite drastically because of the evidence of negativity. And to go and just to add to Geoff's point about drug use, I was like, I would agree. I think drugs should be decriminalised, but again, that's for another panel. But the issue, that issue, when you're then putting all these people who are criminalised for their drug use in the community, and you put them in custody, and given the current state of prisons and expecting it to be better because there are more drugs there, people get put into prison deliberately. I've met them who have done that to manage their drug empire in custody because it's so much more lucrative there. And I've got some ridiculous stories in terms of, because of the lack of staff, the people running the drugs on the wings are basically in control, because the only way that the staff can keep themselves safe is to not to actively, aggressively police things, because otherwise they'll get themselves into trouble. And I had a recent issue in a northwest prison. I won't say specifically because I need to be able to get back into these prisons, so I can't be too negative about them. But I had a couple of clients who happened to share a cell, and I had visits one after the other, and one of them I had the visit with him, and he goes away, and then it takes a little while for the second chap to come back, and he comes back, he's in the same trousers as the first chap, because they share a cell, and they're both so indebted to the dealers of spice on the wing that they've sold everything except one pair of trousers between them.
I think there's a really important point on drugs in prison, and it's about supply. I mean, everybody thinks it comes in tennis balls being thrown over. Yeah, sometimes.
There's only one way it gets in that volume.
Carrier pigeons, all the rest of it. And you do need to get back in prison, so I don't expect you to say this. But the biggest supply of drugs going into prison is from staff.
Staff. Now, I'm happy to say that.
There's absolutely no question about it, and always has been. And once you've done it once, you are then in hock. There's no way that you can get out of that of running that supply. I think that one of the things that really is important is that I do live in a community where we had the mass release of prisoners overnight in 2000. We had nearly 1,000 prisoners released from prison, some of whom were serving life sentences, some had only just been sentenced in the previous few years, and they were all released on licence. That was part of the agreement that brought peace in Northern Ireland. It's part of the agreement that was brought peace in South Africa. It was part of the agreement that brought peace in Argentina. Now, in those situations, it's seen okay because it's to the benefit of governments to try and create a settled society post-conflict. What we don't identify in our own society is that it's a conflicted society, not at war, but a conflicted society in terms of class, in terms of racism, in terms of sexism, heterosexism, and that the outworkings of that conflict, as opposed to a war, although it is, thanks to George Bush, considered to be a war on drugs, but the outworkings of that is a prison. And I think it's actually trying to transfer our mindset from releasing many of those people who committed incredibly serious acts of violence, many of whom I know personally, some of whom are now in government if Stormont was sitting, are now in government in the north of Ireland. the outworkings of that transferred into how we could approach the process here. And I think that the final thing I just wanted to say on that, and I feel like I'm hogging it, but the final thing I want to say on that is to dispense with the language of imprisonment, of prison, and to look for what Angela Davis, remember Angela Davis, convicted as a Black Panther, now a world-leading authority in the School of Law in Santa Barbara on imprisonment. She talks about the constellation of alternative strategies and institutions. We can't just end prison tomorrow, but what we have to put in place in our communities are appropriate centres through which people who have troubled lives can actually be identified and self-identify and go through those processes of habituation in their communities. But they're open to all in their communities. Their husbands, their wives, their sons, their daughters, their grandfathers, their grandmothers, their best friends. That constellation of alternatives, much cheaper, with specialist trained people working on those key issues in the way in which it's done in Scandinavia, that is the alternative to the notion of imprisonment. It's cheaper, it's more effective, and it creates a much happier society.
Or we could just hang them all.
let's definitely not do
That's
that.
another panel.
I think
that wasn't a reference to the current cabinet, was it?
I think moving away from politics there, I think what I'd like to do to wrap up very, very, very quickly so we can have time for some questions is you've touched there, Phil, on some of the things that we can, we've discussed at length. The reality for prisoners in prison is pretty grim, to say the least. That there are problems with funding, there are problems with trained staff, having enough of those staff to deal with the conditions and the serious offences of the people that they're looking after. So what can we do about it? What can we do? Is there a role for the private sector, for example? The last 10 years we've seen quite a lot of privatisation in prisons. Is that helping, or what else can we do? Phil's already mentioned perhaps looking to Scandinavian models of prison. So yeah, Geoff, Emma, what things?
Very briefly, no.
What other things can we do?
You can get Sky in private prisons, though.
But is there anything practical that we can do to help, alleviate this problem? What are some practical solutions that the UK should be looking at?
You'll alleviate the problem if you change the system so you're not sending as many people to jail. You don't need almost 87,000 people in jail. We didn't have that number 15, 20 years ago. What's changed? Crime's falling across the Western world, and yet when we're locking up, and it's not because we're locking up more people, crime's falling for other rates. We just need to change that approach, and then if you've got more resources for less people in prison, you'll be able to do more for them.
So just to elaborate slightly on the private prison point, is that private prisons are more expensive than public prisons, and they do things because they have a profit motive. They underreport things. So for example, I occasionally go into prisons to represent people who have are alleged to have breached prison rules, independent adjudications, and the private prisons get fined by the government for high rates of indiscipline, so they just don't report the most serious ones. So when I go into a HMP to represent people, there'll be 70 cases on that docket that day with the judge, and I go into, say, Old Course in Merseyside, there'll be 5 because they don't report them because they don't want to get fined. It doesn't mean that they're less. That doesn't mean that they're more more safe. Yeah. It just means that they're hiding things, and then ultimately they're more expensive. So I don't think. And there's also an issue with some private companies involved in private prison. There's a DHL warehouse in HMP Leyhill where they work, and there's a call centre in Haverig, and I have all kinds of problems with that because they don't get paid proper wages and things like that, but that's a whole other discussion. In terms of what else we can do, I think there needs to be a drastic reduction in the prison numbers at the moment. Ideally, I'd want more staff, but that's not something that happens overnight. They need to be properly trained, because I certainly don't want someone with 2 weeks training going on a wing at Long Lartin or something they had issues with the other day. So that's a more long-term thing. But right now, to try and alleviate at least some of the issues that I see every day at the moment, there needs to be a very drastic reduction quite quickly in numbers, but I can't see that happening at the moment.
So not really a positive outlook to end on there, really. It's pretty bad. That's it. So I'd like to open the floor to some questions then. So we've got time for a few questions. Kat?
Thank you. You mentioned earlier, Emma, people who are declaring innocence. Is it true that if you can't get out of prison if you're declaring your innocence? You have to kind of accept responsibility for your offence, but if you're actually inappropriately jailed, why would you do that?
So this it only affects people who have got indeterminate sentences, because if you've got a determinate sentence, you're going to get out at the end anyway, or halfway. Normally, your stance on the crime won't affect your release. But if you are a mandatory lifer, say for murder, or an indeterminate sentence prisoner for something else, then your release is determined by the parole board, and the parole board have to be satisfied that your risk of serious harm is manageable in the community. And now the normal way that you do that is that you usually is that you admit, obviously you say, well, yeah, I did commit this offence, and you're able to articulate why you did it, and then what work you have done and things to work out why you did it, to say that you are confident that if you in a similar situation won't act in the same way. People who maintain their innocence, it's not impossible, it is much harder to maintain, to get out. So what you have to do is a slightly different exercise for the parole board, where what you have to do is look at what led you to be in a position where you were open to be accused of what you've been convicted of, and see if there were any issues and flaws in your life or what was going on at the time as to what led you to be in a situation where you could be accused of that crime. Or if you have other previous offences that you do accept, you could talk about those, but then what the parole board then say, well, we haven't talked about this one you're in prison for now, so are we sure that we fully understand why you did it? So it's not impossible, but it is harder for people that maintain their innocence. But luckily, they are doing some things in terms of courses. So like I mentioned before, Horizon and Kaizen now can be gone on if you maintain your innocence, whereas a lot of the offending behaviour work, as a prerequisite, you have to accept that you did it.
I mean, the accepted principle has always been that if you do maintain your innocence, then you'll serve your full time. I mean, that's always been the basic principle among prisoners, and it also been the case. I mean, I was working with a guy just very recently who maintained his innocence. He was originally sentenced for 8 years. He kicked off. He became a really stroppy prisoner because he tried every avenue. He was released 2 years ago. 28 years he served. Yeah. His sentence originally was 8.
Yeah. And then another, just to add to that point, is that with maintaining innocence, there's often an assumption, and this is something I try sometimes, very rarely successfully, with the parole board, the idea that maintaining innocence in and of itself is sometimes considered to be risky, that the idea that you're not admitting it means that you're more dangerous, but that actually the literature doesn't back that up. There's no evidence that maintaining of innocence actually is indicative of being more dangerous. It can in fact be, assuming that you have done it and you're falsely maintaining innocence, quite often it's actually the level of shame about the fact you've committed that offence is actually a very powerful motivator to not do it again. But the sort of the accepted wisdom is that maintaining innocence makes you more dangerous because you've not addressed your risks.
Okay, should we take another question? Kat?
So I think we accept the system is broken and the prisoners aren't being rehabilitated. If we did decide to mass release the prisoners, say 10% on the shorter sentences, I'm thinking heroin addicts that shoplift and people that drink too much and have scuffles on the weekend. We accept that they're already in this revolving door. Aren't they likely to maintain or remain in the revolving door, and we'll just have 8,000 more victims because we're releasing them too early?
Well, it depends if you've got a probation service that's working. We shouldn't have privatised that either.
That was going to be my next question.
Yeah.
Perhaps maybe a better solution might be to increase the infrastructure, the investment in the infrastructure, the probation, and have a more gradual process rather than a mass release. So I just wonder what your thoughts on that were.
Well, seeing as I raised the issue of mass release, I'm not talking about mass release, I'm talking about a graduated release. I was very clear to say, and in all the work I do, I'm very clear about this, that there has to be in place in the community appropriate alternatives, not only to support the prisoners, but to support who are being released, but also to support their families. We have to remember, when a prisoner goes to prison, we are not sentencing just a person, we're sentencing a family. And the absolute outworkings of that in the community can be massive. I mean, a lot of cases I've worked on where I've spent time with families who can't disclose or feel they can't disclose that it's usually the man in the family is in prison because the children will be bullied at school. Now, the outcome of imprisonment, we always seem to think, is about an individual and a community, and it's based around safety. But for every single prisoner, there is an average of 3 immediate people around them who are really impacted by that person's imprisonment. So there has to be an appropriate support network within communities for the families as well as for the person who's committed those offences. We've seen all kinds of alternatives worked all over the world that do really genuinely work, but there is a real reluctance to invest in them because this is going to take 5 years to put into operation, to build the infrastructure and have appropriate people. I don't mean people who are trained as probation officers now, because they are trained in the system as it stands, with a completely different way of thinking, a completely different way of approaching what we call low-level offences. And in that situation, you create within communities appropriate supports, not just for the people who have committed those offences and being caught, but for all the others in that community or equally committing those offences and not being caught. You know, as I said before, violence against women, you know, is endemic within our communities. So in that situation, those appropriate alternatives have to be put in place. That's where the investment is large, because you've still got your prisons running while you're trying to invest in that development. But that transitional period of about 5 years is what it would take, and it would take amazing investment, but it would also take a real shift in imagination. And I'm absolutely determined that that is, you know, what I will continue to argue for, because otherwise we are on the downward spiral that we're already seeing. It's completely out of control. It will get worse. The attitudes within our society will become more vindictive. The Jeremy Kyles will live off the back of that. And I think that, you know, there has to be a real approach where we all consider this is our collective responsibility. It's not something to be left to others.
I think that's a perfect note to end on there. So we've run out of time, I'm afraid, so I'd like to thank the panel for joining us today. Thank you very much.